key drivers, like specific drivers of why people are feeling the way that they're feeling right now? So I know it might seem obvious, but perhaps you could speak to some of the underlying human needs that may not be met at a time like this.
Yeah, exactly. So I think when we're feeling lots of anxiety and there's like lots of uncertainty, so uncertainty and threat are what generates anxiety, that kind of not knowing what's coming next, or having all of these threats. And actually a lot of people have quite real threats right now in terms of things like the financial crisis and things like that. Or if someone's feeling a lot of anger, that tends to come from a sense of injustice, which comes from maybe some of the social problems. Feeling things are like outside of your control. A lot of this are things we're talking about are external events. So feeling hopeless or helpless is kind of a part and parcel of that experience. I think there's also something about that awareness of our own vulnerability. So a lot of people might have been struggling with things like this for a long time and pushing through, or have sought help, maybe not even pushing through. But a lot of people, some of this is very new, some of these feelings, and maybe they haven't been in this circumstance before. And that really is quite confronting, I guess, in terms of our vulnerability or fragility in a way. Plus just the fatigue. It's like one thing after another, it just kind of wears us down. It's a bit like Groundhog Day as well. So I think some of these things are quite obvious in terms of why we're feeling this way, but it's really important to label them and name them as well.
Yeah. And so what I'm taking away from that is that these are very normal human responses to the situation that we find ourselves in, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's really important not to overpathologize things. So these situations are really, really difficult, and what people are experiencing are kind of very normal reaction to that. Obviously, some people then develop mental health problems as well, but I think it's important just to kind of take stock and normalize as well.
Just one last question for yourself, Kate.
Mm-hmm.
How would this translate, or how do you see this translating into our experience at work? What impact might it be having on us in the workplace?
Sure. I think sometimes it's really like this artificial divide, isn't it, between home and work? And while that's helpful in terms of giving yourself headspace and having that divide, we can't really, how we're going to be feeling at work. So we can move that between contexts. So I think exactly how it's presenting at home, you're probably going to find at work. So if you're stressed or anxious or worried, that's going to play out, potentially might play out in terms of your performance, as well as just how you're feeling day to day, and then the impact that might have on teams. And I think some people with COVID particularly have had a bit of a reset as well about maybe their priorities, and maybe work previously was priority number one, and actually they've kind of reassessed and maybe it's not so high, maybe family and friends or health are kind of higher. So I think it can play out in so many ways, but just as it would at home as well.
Exactly. I mean, we're human beings at home, we're human beings at work, we're human beings, right? And so, Lindsay, we often at Unmind talk about this taking a whole person approach for this very reason, to mental health at work. We can't just divorce the rest of our life from the work, or our life at work, as it were. So what are your thoughts on this, and how does this invite us to think about how we show up at work right now?
First of all, I'm just listening to Kate speak, and I'm already feeling better just having her name everything that's going on, and hopefully people at home feel the same way. So it's so powerful when people just label and say the thing that you might be feeling. And I think we instantly may relax in that situation. So yeah, my background is in organizational psychology. So how do we apply all of this to how we work? And it's important to remember that we are not resources. We're not human resources, we're people. And so we bring with us our personal history and our family situation and all of this context from the past into the way that we work. And I think two things are really important to remember. One is we tend to do what's called a fundamental attribution error, which is a fancy way of saying that when something bad happens to us, we tend to blame or think about the circumstances, the context, the environment, the mental health situation. But when something bad happens to someone else, or they do something bad, we tend to blame the person. And so I think for us, we can just sort of gut check and notice our reaction to what other people are doing, our reaction to the struggles other people are having, and just to be cognizant of our own bias there, to either blame the environment or the person, and just be more aware is probably a combination, and give people a bit more grace. So that's one thing to do. And the second way this may play out, just a little bit more of a neuroscience here is that we tend to ruminate on negative emotions much more than the positive ones. Negative and positive emotions actually are processed in different parts of our brain, different hemispheres is what research tells us. And so if you are someone who is holding on to the negative so much more than the positive, that's normal. And that's just how our brain works. And so at work, one piece of criticism can really set us off. And if you compound everything else that's happening, all of this is just so normal. So again, I think my recognition or my request is just to give each other a bit more grace in this moment and recognize it's really not us, it's our brains and it's the environment and everything else that's going on.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, I love that word grace. It also makes you think of compassion, right? Also, like, I mean, self-compassion, certainly, and compassion for each other during a time like this is really important. You know, as human beings, we have a strong need for things like safety and security and certainty and control. And obviously, those kinds of things, people might perceive them being unmet to varying degrees at the moment. So that can then trigger feelings of distress and threat. What impact do those kinds of feelings then have on us, like within our teams, for example? So Lindsay, I'll ask it to you.
Sure. Yeah, I think you mentioned, we're wired for safety and control. That's we really just want to keep ourselves safe. And when we feel under threat, I think one of the ways that this may manifest specifically with managers is sort of managing with more of a sense of control or fear, meaning just holding on a bit tighter to things. Did you do the thing? Did you check the box? Looking at deadlines a bit more. And I think we can either manage out of fear or we can manage out of hope. And sometimes when we feel under threat or in this way, I just want people to be aware maybe of this tendency and what they tend to be doing and its impact on the team, because that's very, very challenging. And then just the other way that this may impact us, or one of the other ways, is under times of stress or threat, we may do what's called transference, which is taking our feelings about parental figures or people in our past and then putting them on people in authority positions within organizations. This is all unconscious things that we're doing, which means that we're just holding our leaders to a much higher standard. We're looking at them for a lot more reassurance and safety, or projecting onto them a lot more emotions than maybe we had when things were just more copacetic and easier. So they can either be vilified or they can be the hero. So again, all of this is just, oh, wow, I may be doing this or I may be feeling this. And if that's you, then maybe we're giving you some reasons as to why that's happening.
That's really interesting and really important. And I'd like to maybe a little bit later on look at that relationship between leaders and people within the organization and perhaps how we can approach that in a constructive way. But I'd like to stay on the topic of managers, but you mentioned managers there, Lindsay. So, Kate, we know that managers really do play an important role in their teams and therefore their organizations. And that for many people, like they may get their intrinsic needs met or not within their teams, and especially via their managers. But, it's important to state that over the past few years, even, things have been made a lot more difficult for managers than they usually even are. So what can you tell us about the manager experience right now? How must they be feeling right now?
Yeah, sure. We actually did quite a bit of user research recently with managers when we were developing some training. And I think what really came across is that feeling sort of, you're like in the middle of a sandwich or you're pulled in all these different directions. And not only are you doing your kind of current job and going through this yourself, I think that's also really important to flag that managers are also human. They're also experiencing this. So managing that, but also now with mental health just being so much more in people's kind of consciousness and awareness, there is a lot more pressure on managers. I mean, as a clinician, I would say they should have been doing this already, but I think, we're a bit behind perhaps the times. That managers also need to really focus on supporting the mental health of their team, but they don't necessarily have the know-how or the confidence to do that. So not only are they juggling all these plates, but they're also maybe not feeling kind of they have the skills or the confidence to have these conversations. So they've maybe got this extra layer of kind of stress as well. And I think that's something we need to work to address, so that managers don't feel, because they do have a big responsibility, but we shouldn't put it all on their shoulders either. We should upskill the managers, train them, help them have the confidence to have those conversations. But I think importantly, to Lindsay's point, we should also encourage managers to look after themselves in this too. Because if you're just looking after each other all the time and not looking after yourself, then that's going to be really difficult. But we also talked to, I suppose, Lindsay's first point around the idea almost of emotional contagion. So as a manager, say you have a partner at home who's having a really gross day and they're really snappy and irritable, that might be passed on to you, and you're then going to the workplace and you might be passing that on to your team, and that kind of emotion can really travel across people. So really important, I think, for managers to do that self-care, but also that awareness of how they're bringing themselves to work, and then how they can then support others in the team. That was a very long-winded answer, but that's my current thoughts on managers.
May I just jump in there real quick? I think all of this is so important. And because a lot of us are working remotely or in a hybrid world these days, the manager has become maybe an even more important touch point or line of defense than before. Because some of us are really only seeing our team or our manager when we used to see hundreds of people a day. So I can understand why a manager feels even more of the sense of, whoa, how am I supposed to be this barrier to folks? There's a lot more pressure on them than maybe there was before. So we'll talk about interventions later, but this is all meant to be like, yes, wow, take a breath. And this is why building communities of practice and building communities for people to share and connect and lean on each other is so important within organizations, so that you don't feel so alone.
Definitely. Like you said, we will be looking at the so what a little bit later in this session. I think you're doing a great job of really normalizing our collective experience at the moment. I just wanted to say, I see questions coming through in the chat, and some of them look great. If you could put them in the Q&A box, it'll make our job, actually my job, a lot easier when it comes to actually sourcing the questions that I can ask Lindsay and Kate. It's quite difficult for me to track them in the chat itself. Thank you for that. So, Lindsay, we spoke about, well, at Unmind, we often speak about the importance of a whole organization approach when it comes to mental health and well-being. And you mentioned earlier this idea of transference, which I found very interesting. So we recommend a whole organization approach where every person in that organization has a role to play, but we also do recognize the disproportionate influence that leaders play within that organization. So I find there's an interesting dynamic here between this transference that you mentioned, but also just acknowledging this influence that leaders have. So I wonder, like, what are your thoughts on that, first of all? And what are some of the ways that leaders may be unknowingly throwing fuel on the fire right now? We can maybe start there, maybe a little bit later we can look at some of the ways that they can address that. But for now, how might leaders unknowingly be throwing fuel on this fire right now?
Well, talk about giving people grace. It's a really tough job right now, absolutely. And I think to summarize it in just one sentence, then we need to be very mindful, not to be a pun, but mindful, get it, of our sense of not just what we say, but how we say it. And that's something I work with organizations all the time on, is the communication strategy of how they bring change to people. And we tend to focus on what our change will be without maybe having a lens for how it will impact people, how they'll be motivated by it, what we expect them to do because of it. And that tends to be the most important point. What happens after we sort of announce this change, and what are we expecting of folks? So it's much more the emotion, the human experience behind the what of the change. And that's something I think we don't spend enough time on. So that's one thing to think about. But more so, there are so many anxiety producing events in an organization that maybe we're not aware of. Anything from as big as a merger and an acquisition to an email or a calendar invite without context. And when someone is already anxious or when someone's already feeling shaky, these things can really, really be hurtful and harmful. So it's just about being aware that even though it may not be triggering to you or something doesn't affect you or you've done this a million times, not everybody has that experience. So that's just really, really something to be aware of, and how little actions can trigger a fear response in people, which, as we know, can affect productivity, morale, engagement, and so on.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Do you have anything to add to that, Kate, before we start?
No, I think that was a really good summary.
Yeah, no, I agree. So you've really done a great job of helping to normalize the experience, the feelings of anxiety, given the state of play right now. And we've looked at some of the knock-on effects that this can have on our well-being, on our work, on our relationships with people at work, and really across the whole organization. So I think it's really important to recognize the normalcy of this, but it's also great now to look at some of the things that we can practically do too. And I've used this phrase earlier, to throw water on the fire, as it were, rather than more fuel, which effectively takes us to the essence of today's topic, which is controlling the controllables. So, I'm really curious to hear what yourself, Lindsay, and Kate can share with us in terms of just what these controllables are. So, Kate, I guess I'll start with you on an individual level. What are some of the practical things that people can do to help themselves right now? But more specifically, what are the key things that people have some control over from your perspective? And importantly, how can they acknowledge and approach those things that they don't have control over in a way that is also helpful?
Yeah, sure. I think kind of what you're tapping into there is this kind of approach, I can never say this word, but dialectical, where you're holding two concepts that traditionally we feel like we can't hold at the same time. So that's acceptance and change. So sometimes we think we have to either accept something or change something, whereas actually we need to hold those both in mind together, because there will be some things that we need to accept. So a lot of these external events, for example, or even things happening in organizations, it doesn't mean that we condone them or we're happy about them, but we have to sort of acknowledge their presence and accept their presence, whilst then thinking about what we can change. So an example kind of outside of this context, but if you're in an unhealthy relationship, the acceptance would be the bad behavior. So you're accepting the bad behavior, but that's going to lead to suffering. Or the change, so you can try and change the bad behavior, but that's probably not going to work. And that's also going to lead to suffering. So what we need to do is accept, okay, maybe this is an unhealthy relationship, but what can we do? And our action in that situation might be to end the relationship, for example. And I think the same applies here. So it's really thinking, okay, let's spend some time really acknowledging how we're feeling, paying attention to how we're feeling, and accepting the things that we can't change, but then thinking what's in our sphere of control. And sometimes that might only be how you're thinking about something or how you're acting personally, that is within your sphere of control. And that is really difficult and kind of hard to sit with. But it's about finding those things, even small things, and focusing on those. So, for example, breathing and relaxation, that can help take the edge off anxiety just in that moment, or mindfulness can really help you focus kind of in that moment as well. So things like that, they're in your sphere of control, but that isn't saying you accept any of the situation that's going on. The other thing I would say on an individual level is something else you can do is around the practical support. So a lot of the things we're talking about at the moment are related to financial crises, particularly. And in that scenario, there's not really a lot you can do in terms of that change aspect, but you could seek, for example, practical support, financial support, or you could seek support from friends or family to kind of talk about how you're feeling. So it's just about thinking kind of what is going to be helpful to you in that moment, whilst also holding the acceptance in mind, which is a really hard thing to do. And obviously as a clinician, I would also say, if things do escalate and actually you feel you need professional support, one thing in your control is also to seek that. So for that 25% increase we said in anxiety and depression, Those people might want professional support, but that's not going to be everyone. So just finding what works for you to cope in this moment.
Thank you so much. It reminds me of, the Serenity Prayer. I think there's such a powerful invitation in that, exactly what you're referring to here. I think in a nutshell, I think Roger sent this through to us, but change what I can change, accept what I cannot, and learn to know the difference. I think it's been tweaked over the years, but I think those were the original words, but I find it quite powerful. So Lindsay, do you have anything to add to what Kate has just said now in terms of individual strategies?
Sure. So some of these I use myself. A couple of additional emotional regulation strategies. One is to just name the emotion, which research shows actually reduces its weight and can help us just feel better. The second is to reframe. And for those of you who are, Peloton junkies like myself, some of the instructors say, let's reframe working out from you have to you get to. And it sounds quite cheesy, but these opportunities to reframe things that are challenging and difficult actually can be shown to reduce their power as well. It's quite hard to go from anxiety to a sense of calm. Research actually shows it's much easier to turn that anxiety into something that you're excited about. And as I may say, this probably sounds impossible, but they're similar arousal states. So if we can find a way to shift some of that anxiety, something that you're excited about, you might find that, again, it takes some of the edge off and redirects that energy. At work, I think we spoke about how negative emotions can really be front stage or center stage for us right now. So a couple of ways to bring back that sense of positivity and positive emotions. One is to just sort of keep a piggy bank or a kudos file of good things that have happened to you, or compliments or positive feedback that you've received to look at maybe when you're feeling sad or down or anxious, just as a way to sort of lift your spirits and remind you of the positive things that surround you. And a couple other things is to really think about what small wins or progress you've accomplished. There's a researcher and a professor, Teresa Amiable, who speaks about progress coming from small wins. So if we think that something feels insurmountable, we can maybe remind ourselves what action we've taken or how we've made progress on something over the course of a year or a day. So those are a few things to try, and we can talk more about some more maybe later on as well.
Yeah. I love all of those. Those are all really practical ways of helping to cultivate a more positive emotional state, which can be protective under these circumstances that we've been talking about today. Do you have anything else to add, Lindsay, in terms of what people can do at a team level? Like what are some of the things that people can take control over, especially like we mentioned earlier, managers? How can managers engage with and relate to their people in their teams in constructive ways?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to offer here. A couple of thoughts. It probably can be overwhelming to think about what are the areas I should focus on in my team. If everything is anxiety producing, how do I support people? And what I suggest is to think about what tend to be the most anxiety producing moments in an employee's journey are when we're going through a transition or doing something new for the first time. So that can be onboarding, joining an organization, or becoming a manager, or being a parent, or becoming a parent for the first time. These are transition moments. They're what I call high leverage moments when people are most needing and open to change and support. So if you were to focus just on specific areas in the journey for an employee, it would be those moments. And for you as a manager to recognize those moments and offer support for employees at that specific time. So that's one thing I'd practically say. And a phrase that may be beneficial to folks as well is to try as much as you possibly can to make your thinking visible. I had a mentor of mine who drilled this phrase into me all the time when I used to facilitate classes and workshops as a way to promote safety for people who are learning something new. And what making your thinking visible means is to share the why of what you're doing. The reason I'm giving you this feedback is I believe in you and I want to support you. The reason I'm having this meeting is X. We can't assume that people know why or what's in our head. or what we're thinking. And so if we can focus on making that thinking visible for people as much as we can reduce that sense of anxiety and promote a sense of safety, which opens up a lot of thinking centers of the brain and has a ton of positive effects, as we know.
I love that. Make your thinking visible. That makes a lot of sense, especially given just a lot of the uncertainty that people are experiencing right now. So that seems like a very powerful thing that people can do, managers specifically, managers and leaders. So Kate, on that note, do you have anything further to add in terms of what people can do at a team level for managers, etc., but also maybe what leaders more broadly can do to help their people right now? You know, how can they create a culture and an environment that helps to reduce feelings of anxiety across their organization?
Yeah, sure. I loved all of Lindsay's examples there. I think they're really spot on. Like, I'm also seeing the chat pop up as well, and so many other examples people have got, which I love, just kind of sharing that learning. I like the example you said earlier about just something as simple as sending an invite or an email without any context. You know, if your manager says, just book something in your diary, that can just generate anxiety for a lot of people. And the manager doesn't have that intention. And maybe that meeting is actually about something really positive, but it's just thinking about sort of our micro behaviors like that and making sure that we're removing any uncertainty where we can by just, you know, put a note in the email, like nothing to worry about, or not something like that, just as an explainer. So I would say as a manager or a leader, I think the most important thing right now is to give the space for this. So almost like name the elephant in the room, whether that's the external events that are happening, or maybe, you know, within companies. A lot of companies have faced redundancies, lots of staff turnover and things like that. So there's lots of internal stuff. And the worst thing I think you can do is just ignore that. I think it's really important just to have that space and say, actually, this is really hard right now. And really use those like active listening skills of just giving people that space to share how they're feeling and really listen. So don't be distracted, or don't try and move them quickly to problem solving, to just, it is a bit tricky, but to sit with that emotion and just really listen. I'd say that's like the biggest thing in your toolbox as a leader. And then after that, once you've gone through that, then you can offer different types of support, like ask the person what they might need in that moment, and really make that kind of time specific. Because as a manager or leader, there might be things you can do. You might be able to change workload or ways of, you know, be a bit more flexible in your ways of working and stuff like that. So it is important to give that support, but only after you've done that listening piece. Probably another thing for leaders is just role modeling. So when we're talking about all of these strategies and the emotional contagion, to actually like practice what you preach as well. So by role modeling, you're giving other people permission to do those things. So as an example in Unmind, what I love is, well, I love your diary, Steve, and Nick's diary, the CEO, where you can actually see like when you're taking wellbeing breaks, and that you're really, really like truly practicing what you preach. So it's not just back-to-back meetings, but you're scheduling that in. And I think like when I go to book a meeting with you, I then see that. And I think that just reinforces the message that that's just really important to the company. And that's something that I am then able to do. So I think that kind of not only walking the talk, but also sharing that you're doing that's really important. And maybe something around the connection. So I think to Lindsay's point before with hybrid working, that it's more challenging than ever to do this. But one thing that we know really can buffer some of this stress and some of the how people feel during these, you know, times of uncertainty and change, are having that like real camaraderie sense of belonging. So if there's anything you can do to bring your team together, even if that's remote, to really sort of cement and develop those relationships, that's just so important. And that doesn't have to just come from managers, it can come from the team themselves, but really prioritizing that connection, sense of belonging, and all that sort of stuff as well. Yeah. So it feels like a lot. And I guess what I was saying before about the manager might feel that's a lot on their shoulders, but there's a lot that other people can help with too. I think it shouldn't just fall on managers and leaders, but they do have a really important responsibility in the culture just because of where they're positioned. They're more likely to be able to influence kind of upwards in terms of systems and processes, but also they're almost holding the umbrella above their team to buffer some of that stress as well. So I think they are really fundamental, but again, it's about upskilling and giving managers the confidence to do those things as well.
Definitely. definitely. I mean, there's been so many great things shared here. An important thing to say is that, and I think you might have mentioned this earlier, Lindsay, like we're hardwired to pay attention to the negative as human beings, to things that might be threatening. And during a time like this, with our collective allostatic loads higher than they might usually be, like that hardwiring becomes even more extreme, as it were. So it really does speak to just how important we are showing up for each other, how important that is. And some of the things that you've mentioned, they might seem like little micro things that we can do, but they can either help to alleviate, they can either help to like accentuate the negative or alleviate it. And I guess what I'm trying to get at here, or the question underlying this is, maybe Lindsay, I'll ask you, is there like a heuristic or a framework or something that you would suggest that we, all of us, whether you're a leader, manager, or anyone within the organization, can hold in their mind when engaging with others? Is it something that they can ask themselves, which you feel might invite or promote the kinds of ways of showing up that are positive and beneficial for each other?
I mean, I'm tempted to share a model. It might be a little bit too much. So I could share the SCARF model if you'd like. So let me just say, I think as we're talking, we are emotional beings. We make decisions with our emotions. And if this feels like too much or too much to do, just know that this is happening in the background all the time anyway. It's just a core part of our job. It's a core part of who we are as humans. And it's just something we have to learn how to get better to do. So just to name that. And I believe more organizations should be rewarding folks for getting better at managing emotions and helping people in this way, and not just focusing on hard metrics. I think that is a really important lesson and my hope for folks. I think the heuristic or the model to keep in mind is what tends to reduce threat and what tends to increase threat in people is really 5 things. It's status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And this is a model by the Neuroleadership Institute and a man named David Rock. I'm a big fan of their work. And if you Google this later, the SCARF model, I hope this will help give you more context, but maybe more support as well. But just to keep in mind that if we're triggered by something, especially in the workplace, it tends to be because of one of these 5 triggers. And I don't need to go through all 5 maybe just now, but just think about, are you triggered by a sense of fairness, sense of relatedness, that you belong, sense of autonomy, that we have a choice, sense of certainty, we'll talk about that a lot today, or a sense of status. All of these things can play into the way that we're feeling and the way we can be triggered by anything from a performance review to a meeting without context.
I think that's powerful. It's something that we can hold in mind and just ask ourselves, are we meeting those needs or not? And I recognize that we can't place the world on our shoulders, but I think it's a helpful model for sure. So I'm aware of the time passing by, and we have a load of fantastic questions here. So I do think it would be worth going into the Q&A now, and then we can wrap things up towards the end. So I'm going to start with a question for yourself, Kate. The question is, how can you look out for the well-being of your team without going too deep or having to play the role of therapist?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. And I think sometimes that is the fear that holds managers back, because they don't know where that boundary is. Mm-hmm. So I think there's something, again, like active listening, and doing that in checking in with people, asking how they are, and having that space, but then signposting people to the right sources of support. So I think it's really important that managers don't feel they need to be in that therapist role, or they don't need to problem solve for that person. It's more about listening and supporting that person to seek the right help. And that might be signposting to professional support or HR policies, or whatever it might be that they might need. Because I think the danger is it's quite easy to flip into that. And obviously that's not the manager's role at all. It's about just trying to spot difficulties, create that really positive culture where people can talk about how they're feeling and any struggles, and then signpost to the right support, whatever that may be. And just being mindful of that, I think, is really important when you're meeting with someone about where that boundary is. And I think just through practice as well, you just kind of start learning where that boundary is as well. It's not until we do that and we have those conversations, I think, that it truly kind of hammers home what we should be doing.
Great. Thank you, Kate. We've got a question here from Rosella. I think this is for you, Lindsay. Rosella just asked if you could provide more practical examples of reframing. I think that really landed with people. And I think Rosella missed the one that you gave an example. So is there like a practical way that people can actually reframe?
Sure. The example I gave was, one from Peloton of we don't have to work out, we get to work out. Silly, but reframing something that feels difficult to do and something that we are privileged to do, that we're lucky to do. And the power of doing that again and again is that reduces these threats and helps us feel like we're in more control. If it's something like having a difficult conversation with someone, which can be very anxiety producing, a strategy might be thinking about, wow, I get to improve the relationship with somebody else. I'm anxious about it, but I'm excited to make things better. I'm excited to build my connection with someone else. I'm excited to take a positive step forward. In each of these anxiety producing moments, what's something that on the other side gives you excitement and joy and hope? That's something that I think people can consider before these difficult conversations, as one example.
That's great. Thank you, Lindsay. Kate, we have one for you here. So Kate, you mentioned about signposting to mental health support, obviously, and mind is one, but how do you tactfully approach a conversation when you can see someone has been triggered, but they don't realize it?
Yeah, I think that's so tricky, isn't it? Especially, and it depends a lot, I think, on the relationship you have with someone. So if you have developed quite a strong relationship, it probably is going to feel a bit easier to have that conversation. But I would say it probably is worth addressing, but I think you also have to maintain like a curious stance. So rather than just presuming, that trigger has led to that, because there might be lots going on behind the scenes that you don't know. So I would always say, approach that person in a very kind of safe space. So somewhere where it's very private, you set it up in more of a relaxed way so people feel comfortable, and just ask that sort of curious question of, oh, I noticed this happened, and you react, like stick to the facts, and then invite them to share. And of course, it might be that people aren't necessarily ready to hear that, but they might go away and reflect on it later. And then you might be able to have that conversation again, or perhaps they change it as well. So I think, just approach it with curiosity, kindness. I think compassion is a huge big theme that we're talking about as well, would be the way that I would go about it. It is tricky.
Thanks a lot, Kate. I'm not intentionally going back and forth here, Lindsay, Kate. It seems to be the way it's playing out here, but Lindsay, this is a good question. You mentioned that it's really important that we don't view people as human resources. It's a very important thing, obviously, but how can we encourage leaders to see their employees as humans and not resources, and make compassionate decisions accordingly, even if it's the less cost-effective options? I think it's a really good question.
Well, there's a lot of research done that basically shows that, taking care of humans first actually benefits the business in the long run.
Yeah.
And I would look to Adam Grant and his work for more details on that research. But the research and the data points to the benefit of this more than anything else, and the numbers don't lie. And so if you're having trouble convincing folks of that, that's really the place to start. I would say just empathy for folks in that situation, for leaders in that situation. There's a lot at stake for them as well: business results, KPIs, revenue. And so often my work is not just sharing best practices, but thinking about what is getting in the way of these best practices, what's getting in the way of this advice. And oftentimes it's their own fear and what's at stake for them around not delivering these to the board, to investors, et cetera. So I think just, again, having grace for that. But oftentimes, the research just shows that treating people as humans is a good business decision.
100%. Thank you, Lindsay. The next question is for either of you. I think many people could relate to this. So this person wrote, I'm a very detail-oriented person, and I do try to live with a positive outlook. However, I frequently find myself at work thinking about all the things that I have to do or get done at home. And when at home, constantly thinking about all the things that I need to get done at work. It's always about the other job or responsibilities. Do you have any suggestions to realign them appropriately? So I'm sure it's a common experience for many of us. I'm not sure if either of you have any thoughts you'd like to share.
I think I was just going to say something quite practical, because I think this is a really common theme, and it's again that homework divide, because you're then not in the moment and you're kind of thinking about all of the things to do in the other context. So something just really practical of listing all of those things, so that almost you're parking them to come back to later. And if you notice your mind wandering, that's why you can practice mindfulness to sort of bring your mind back to the present. And if you're really focused and engaged on what you're doing, you can get into a bit of flow with your work, for example, then your mind's less likely to go back there. But doing that in a really kind way, because I think when you have got a lot on, you've got so many plates spinning, that's also really natural for your mind to be doing that, because our mind likes things to be complete and not have these kind of uncertain things hanging around as well. So I would go practical and kind of train your mind back to the present, but do that in a really kind, compassionate way to yourself as well.
I may add as well, as Kate's speaking, I'm looking at my whiteboard list literally on my wall next to me that has a list of work and home things. So just practically it works. But for many of us that work from home now, we've lost the ritual of how we say goodbye to the workday, because we're literally getting up and walking to our kitchen, whereas we may have had this commute. So again, I'm taking a lot of this from the research that just shows that we need to find a way to sort of close that chapter of the day and put that to the side. So whatever ritual that is for you that allows you to literally leave things at quote unquote work, whether it's taking a walk around the block, etc. I think bringing those rituals into your day hopefully will help as well.
Thank you both. I think those are really insightful. So I have a question here from Roger. So I'm a manager. I need to seek clues about the mental health of my colleagues above, below, horizontal. And to do that, I have to know what their personal challenges are, their aspirations, their concerns. So the question within all of this is, what are the key clues that I can look out for as a manager that someone is struggling? So Kate, shall we start with you?
Yeah, I would say it is tricky, because I think although you can pick up on some clues, so for example, if someone's just behavior is not what it normally would be. So for example, if someone's normally the life and soul of the party and goes to all the social events and suddenly isn't coming to any, that would be a red flag of, okay, something's changed for this person, kind of maybe we should have that conversation. They might be snappy, they might be irritable, they might be tearful, or so it can be really shown in behavior, but a lot of the time it isn't. And I think that's why we really need to normalize these conversations, because not everything is visible. Some people might be struggling a lot inside and just nobody is actually aware of that on the outside. So I think part of how to tackle that is developing that really positive culture around mental health, where it just becomes part of your everyday, is checking in with people and asking how they are, sharing how you are as well, as much as you're comfortable. So that becomes the norm, so that if someone is struggling and you can't spot it, it's still going to come up anyway. So you can then have those conversations and signpost them, not necessarily just as a manager, but also as a colleague. You might spot those changes, or just having that conversation, something might come up as well. So just, be mindful that it's not always visible as well.
Thank you, Kate. Lindsay, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think we're missing a lot of those clues and signals now when we are working from home, assuming that that's the case for a lot of folks. We don't have a lot of that visibility. We're looking through a screen or seeing what we see on chat or an email. So it's hard to know. But one thing to consider is just how quickly we move into the work without thinking about the relational aspect of it, the process of how we work together. So to Kate's point, every meeting can start with a check-in. How are we doing today? Then it normalizes that it's okay to speak about it. And we're not just focused on immediately moving into the work. We take time to connect as humans and make that part of how our team works together. Or when you take a new member onto your team as a manager, that first conversation of how we set expectations can be really key to setting the tone that you care about the person and will be checking in and want to know how they are as a human being and as a whole person.
Yeah, I love that. I like to think of it as like human first, role second when it comes to the workplace today. So there's so many questions. We don't have enough time to get to them all, but I'm going to finish with this last question here before we begin to wrap things up, because I think it's relevant and resonant for all of us. So Nick asked, how do we manage what we read and hear in the media? Because this can really affect our mental health, it can affect how we show up at work, how we lead. The war is probably the big one. So along with that, what always feels like doom and gloom around the news, etc., cost of living. So I guess the question in here is, how do we navigate all of this? How do we manage this in a way that is as constructive as it possibly can be for us and for the people around us at work? So Lindsay and Kate, feel free to share from whatever perspective you'd like, whether it's just your own personal life or more broadly than that.
I just saw someone in the comment just wrote, "Don't watch the news" in capitals.
Well, yeah.
And I would say, obviously, you want to be aware of kind of the events that are going on around you, but it can be, if you just get sucked into that news, it can be 24/7. And I think that's when it's then not helpful, because generally the news shows you the bad news. You don't necessarily have like the good news. There's actually a company called the Happiness Newspaper, I think that's the name, that just shares good news of like a cat that was rescued, or like all these like stories that are just really feel good. So I think it's about boundarying the time. So if you want to watch the news, that's fine, but just don't get too absorbed in it, and balance that with other stuff so that you're not just hearing this kind of doom and gloom as well.
Thank you, Kate. Lindsay?
I would say ditto to what Kate said, and to find the things that do bring you joy and get you back to center, whether it's playing tennis or speaking to a friend on the phone. You know, those things are really, really important, not just to numb ourselves, but to experience the wide range of emotions that we can feel.
Great. And I see people are sharing links here to the Positive News, Happy Newspaper, Good News Network. So there's definitely some other news options out there as well. So thanks for sharing, everyone. I can't believe that literally an hour is almost up. So, I mean, first of all, Kate and Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us as guests today. Kate, would you mind sharing and telling our users some of the unmind tools that you feel would be particularly helpful for people at a time like this?
Yeah, sure. So we've got lots of in the moment tools. So the exercises I mentioned before on things like breathing, relaxation, mindfulness, sleep, because I think sleep's actually one that we probably haven't covered, but it's quite a big issue as well. So lots of in the moment tools people can tap into, as well as deeper dives into things. So if someone's struggling with mood or worry or anxiety, we've got kind of courses that can talk them through that as well. And we've also got something that I love where you can also share it with like a colleague or friend. So I think it's also not just the support for yourself, but kind of passing that on to other people as well. So yeah, all sorts that are not just at the clinical end, though obviously we include those, but also that prevention end, things like gratitude, and these are the things that you've both mentioned as well. So yeah, lots of tools and tricks to help people, as well as also some manager training that we've done, because I think we're seeing really that's just really important to get people skilled up on that know-how and confidence, to look after themselves, but also to look after people they manage. So something for everyone.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Kate. And Lindsay, thank you so much. I mean, I love the work you do. I've loved your contribution today. I know that Izzy shared a link to your website earlier, but could you just tell, I guess, our audience where they can find out more about you and your work and follow what you're up to? Sure.
And thanks so much for having me. I've learned so much just from listening to Kate. So this has been fantastic as well. And yes, my expertise and my work is in creating and leading experiences that fuel connection for employees and for the organization. So trainings, offsites, retreats, all hands. I look at these gatherings as ways to really build connection, especially in a remote environment. And I see them as our culture on display. And that's what I help organizations do and enhance.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So this may be a cliched ending, but Kate and Lindsay, if you had just one thing to leave the audience with, what would it be? Starting with you, Kate.
Oh no, don't have the pressure of going first. I would say the biggest thing is just giving yourself space to feel. So rather than trying to jump into problem solving strategies, just really acknowledging that this is a really difficult time, because to Lindsay's point earlier, even just naming it can turn kind of some of those feelings down.
Thank you, Kate. Lindsay?
I would say focus on one thing that you are going to do. Every coaching session ends with what are you going to take with you? What are you going to do? So if we know the one thing, it helps us feel more in control. So as you're listening today and signing off, think about what's the one thing you heard us say that you're going to try. That could increase your sense of confidence and your sense of control.
I love it. So thank you both. And thank you so much to everyone who joined our call today. We hope you got, well, I can see that you definitely got plenty of value from this session. And we hope to see you at the next Unmind event. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your days or evenings.